Imagine a wooden ship, 3 masts, maybe 40 cannons, cutting through open Atlantic water somewhere between the coast of Africa and the Caribbean. On board are 150 men, killers, thieves, mutineers, deserters from the Royal Navy, men who would slit a throat over a share of rum, and somewhere below deck, hunched over a table covered in charts and instruments, sits one man that every single one of them needs alive: the sailing master, the navigator. The only human being on that entire vessel who can look at the sun, look at the stars, glance at a compass, and tell the captain where in the world they actually are. Picture a map of the Atlantic, a vast emptiness of blue between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. No GPS, no radio, no landmarks, nothing but water in every direction for weeks at a time. Now picture a ship somewhere in that blue and erase every modern tool you can think of. No satellite, no sonar, no depth finder, nothing. That is where the sailing master worked, in that emptiness. And the terrifying truth of the age of sail is this: if that one man died, if he fell overboard, if he caught fever, if a cannonball took him during a fight, the ship was lost. Not metaphorically lost, actually, physically, hopelessly lost. 150 armed men floating on a guess. This is the story of the most important person on any pirate ship, the man nobody talks about, the man who held more real power than the captain, and the man who could get a crew home or get them all killed. To understand why the sailing master mattered so much, you need to understand just how impossibly difficult navigation was in the 1600s and 1700s. Today, you pull out your phone, open a map, and a little blue dot tells you exactly where you are down to the meter. You don't even think about it. It just works. But rewind 300 years, and finding your position on the open ocean was one of the hardest problems in the world. Governments offered enormous cash prizes to anyone who could solve it. The British Parliament put up £20,000 in 1714, which in today's money is roughly $3.5 million. That is how desperate people were for a reliable way to figure out where a ship was. Here is the basic problem. When you are at sea and you cannot see land, you have no reference points. There is nothing to orient yourself against. The water looks the same in every direction. The horizon is a perfect circle around you at all times. You are, for all practical purposes, floating in infinity. A sailing master had 2 coordinates to figure out: latitude, meaning how far north or south you are, and longitude, meaning how far east or west you are. Latitude was the easier one. You could measure it by observing the angle of the sun at noon or the angle of the North Star at night using a tool called a cross staff, or later a more accurate device called a backstaff. It was not simple, but a trained navigator could get a reasonable latitude reading on a clear day. Longitude was a nightmare. Before we go any further, I need to stop for a second, because what I've been showing you in these videos only scratches the surface. And I realized at some point that the full picture, the actual pirate code, word for word, the real punishment records, the exact treasure division shares, the ports that secretly funded them, it doesn't fit in a video. I put it all into one document, the Black Flag Codex. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now, let's keep going. An absolute nightmare. There was no reliable way to measure it for most of the age of piracy. The best method available was called dead reckoning, which is exactly as terrifying as it sounds. Dead reckoning meant you started from a known position. Then you estimated your speed, tracked your compass heading, accounted for ocean currents as best you could, and did the math to guess where you had ended up. The word guess is doing heavy lifting in that sentence, because dead reckoning accumulated errors with every passing hour. If your speed estimate was off by even 1 knot, after a week at sea, you could be 100 miles from where you thought you were. If the current was stronger than you assumed, add another 50 miles of error. If the wind shifted overnight and the helmsman didn't correct perfectly, more error. After a month of open ocean sailing, a ship navigating by dead reckoning alone could be off by 200, 300, even 400 miles. And 400 miles of error in the Caribbean could mean the difference between making port in Jamaica and running aground on an uncharted reef in the middle of the night. Ships were lost this way constantly, not to storms, not to enemy fire, but to simply not knowing where they were. This is the world the sailing master lived in, a world where position was not a fact, but an educated guess, updated constantly, refined with every observation, and still capable of being fatally wrong. So what exactly did a sailing master do all day? The work started before dawn. A good navigator rose while it was still dark to take star sightings. If the sky was clear, he could observe the positions of specific stars relative to the horizon and use those angles, combined with astronomical tables, to refine the ship's latitude. He would write these observations down in a log, noting the time, the star observed, the angle measured, and his confidence in the reading. Then came sunrise. At first light, the sailing master would check the compass heading, note the wind direction and strength, and assess the sea state. Was the current running differently than expected? Were there signs of land, birds circling, floating vegetation, changes in water color? Every one of these observations went into his running calculation of where the ship was. At noon, he took the most important reading of the day, the sun's highest point, its zenith. By measuring the sun's angle at its peak with a crossstaff, backstaff, or later a sextant, he could calculate latitude with reasonable accuracy. This noon sight was the anchor of his daily position fix. Everything else was estimation built around this one solid measurement. Throughout the afternoon and evening, he continued tracking speed. The standard method was called heaving the log. A wooden board, the log, was thrown overboard on a rope that had knots tied at regular intervals. As the log floated behind the ship, the rope paid out, and a sailor counted how many knots passed through his hands in a set period of time, measured by a sandglass. That count became the ship's speed in knots, a term we still use today. The sailing master would take multiple speed readings throughout the day and average them. He also maintained the ship's charts. These were precious documents, hand-drawn maps of coastlines, islands, depths, currents, and hazards. A good chart could save a ship, a bad one could destroy it. The sailing master was responsible for knowing which charts were reliable and which were garbage, because in the 1600s and 1700s, plenty of charts were garbage. Coastlines were misdrawn. Islands were placed in wrong positions. Entire reefs went uncharted. The sailing master had to cross-reference every chart against his own experience and the reports of other navigators he trusted. And then there was the weather. The sailing master was expected to read the sky, predict storms, know the seasonal wind patterns, and advise the captain on when to push forward and when to run for shelter. This was not mystical intuition. It was pattern recognition built on years of experience. A master who had sailed the Caribbean for a decade knew what a hurricane sky looked like. He knew the telltale signs of a coming squall. He knew which clouds meant rain in 2 hours and which meant calm for the rest of the day. All of this, the star sights, the noon fix, the speed readings, the chart work, the weather assessment, happened every single day without exception. Navigation was not something you did once and then forgot about. It was a continuous, relentless process that demanded constant attention, and the sailing master was the only person on board trained to do it. Now, here is where the story gets interesting for pirate ships specifically. On a Royal Navy vessel or a merchant ship, the sailing master was a professional officer. He had trained for years, often at a naval academy or under an experienced navigator. He held a formal position in the ship's hierarchy, was paid a salary, and was respected for his expertise. The system produced navigators reliably because the system invested in training them. Pirates did not have a system. Pirates did not run academies. Pirates did not have a pipeline of trained navigators lining up to join their crews. And that created a problem because a pirate ship needed a sailing master just as badly as any other ship. More badly, actually, because pirates could not simply follow established trade routes. They needed to go where the targets were, which meant ranging across enormous stretches of open ocean, often to remote and poorly charted areas. A pirate captain operating in the Indian Ocean or the coast of Madagascar was navigating waters that most European sailors had never seen. Without a competent navigator, that captain was sailing blind. So how did pirates get their sailing masters? The answer, more often than not, was kidnapping. When a pirate crew captured a merchant vessel or a naval ship, one of the first things they did was assess the captured crew for useful skills. Carpenters, surgeons, and navigators were the three most valuable types of prisoner. A pirate ship could survive without a lot of things, but it could not survive without someone who could fix the hull, someone who could treat wounds, and someone who could find the next port. Navigators were often forced men, a term used in pirate courts to describe sailors who had been compelled to serve against their will. This distinction mattered legally because if a forced man was later captured by the authorities, he could argue at trial that he had never chosen the pirate life. He was a victim, not a criminal, and, in many documented cases, this defense actually worked. Courts acquitted forced men regularly, especially navigators and surgeons, because everyone understood the reality. Pirates took these men because they needed them, not because the men wanted to be there. The most famous example is the case of the pirate Bartholomew Roberts, known as Black Bart, who operated in the early 1720s and was one of the most successful pirates in history. Roberts captured over 400 ships during his career, and his operation depended entirely on having skilled navigators. When Roberts' crew took a prize, they would interrogate the captured sailors and pull out anyone with navigation skills. Some of these men eventually became willing members of the crew. Others spent their entire time aboard under duress, doing their job because the alternative was being thrown overboard. And this created a fascinating power dynamic, because the sailing master, whether he had joined willingly or been forced, held a kind of leverage that almost no one else on the ship possessed. He had knowledge that could not be replaced. If the crew mistreated him badly enough, he could simply refuse to navigate. Or worse, he could navigate poorly on purpose, leading the ship into danger. A vengeful or desperate sailing master could run a ship onto rocks, steer it into hostile waters, or simply make mistakes that left the crew stranded and starving hundreds of miles from land. Pirates knew this, and it is one of the reasons why, on many pirate ships, the sailing master was treated considerably better than the average crew member. He often received a larger share of the plunder. He was exempt from some of the harder physical labor. He had better quarters. He was, in a very real sense, the most protected man on the ship, not out of kindness, but out of pure self-interest. Let us talk about the instruments for a moment, because the tools of navigation in this period were beautiful, fragile, and often unreliable. The most basic tool was the magnetic compass, which had been in use since the medieval period. A magnetized needle floating in a bowl of water or balanced on a pivot pointed roughly north, giving the helmsman a reference direction. But roughly is the key word here. Magnetic compasses do not point to true north. They point to magnetic north, and the difference between the two, called magnetic variation or declination, changes depending on where you are on the planet. A sailing master had to know the local variation for every stretch of ocean he sailed and correct for it mentally with every reading. If he got the variation wrong, the ship's heading was wrong, and the dead reckoning built on that heading was wrong too. The cross staff was one of the earliest tools for measuring the angle of a celestial body above the horizon. It was a simple wooden stick with a sliding crosspiece. You held one end to your eye, aimed at the sun or a star, and slid the crosspiece until it aligned with both the celestial body and the horizon. Then you read the angle off a scale marked on the staff. The problem with the cross staff was that measuring the sun required staring directly at it, which over time damaged the navigator's eyes. Many experienced navigators were partially blind from years of solar observations. The backstaff, invented in the late 1500s, solved this problem by allowing the navigator to stand with his back to the sun and measure its shadow instead. It was more accurate and much kinder to the eyes, and it became the standard tool for most of the golden age of piracy. The sextant, which most people picture when they think of nautical navigation, did not come into widespread use until the mid-1700s, which puts it at the tail end of the classic pirate era. The sextant was a precision instrument made of brass and glass that measured angles with far greater accuracy than anything that came before. But it was expensive, delicate, and required careful calibration. A sextant that got dropped or exposed to salt spray could become useless in minutes. Beyond these angle measuring tools, the sailing master relied on astronomical almanacs, which were printed tables showing the predicted positions of the sun, moon, and major stars for every day of the year. These tables were essential for converting raw angle measurements into actual latitude values. Without current almanacs, even a perfect angle measurement was worthless because you could not calculate what it meant. The lead line was another critical tool. This was simply a heavy lead weight on a long rope marked at regular intervals. Dropping it overboard and letting it sink to the bottom told you the water depth, and the bottom of the weight was hollowed out and filled with tallow, a sticky wax that picked up material from the seabed, sand, mud, shells, gravel. An experienced sailing master could identify his approximate position near a coast by the depth reading combined with the type of bottom material, because different stretches of coast had characteristic seabed compositions that he had memorized or recorded from previous voyages. Stop for a second. What you just heard about the pirate code is the part that rewrites everything you thought you knew. But it only lands when you see the actual shares, the exact fractions written into the Articles of Agreement, the punishments, the port records, the names of the men who funded them from government offices. It's all in the Black Flag Codex, linked in the description. 5 seconds, grab it now, because what comes next builds directly on it. Link is below. QR code is on your screen. And then there were the charts themselves. In the 1600s and 1700s, nautical charts were works of art and works of error in roughly equal measure. The best charts were produced by the Dutch and the English, and they were state secrets. Governments guarded their charts jealously because accurate charts were strategic military assets. If your enemy did not know where the reefs were, you had an advantage. If your enemy did not know the safe approaches to your colonial ports, even better. Pirates who captured ships often prized the charts above the cargo. A set of accurate charts for the Indian Ocean or the coast of West Africa was worth more than a hold full of sugar because charts enabled future captures. Without charts, you were groping in the dark. With them, you could plan routes, identify ambush points, and navigate safely to harbors where prizes could be sold. There is a famous incident that illustrates just how catastrophic the loss of navigation could be, and it did not even involve pirates. In 1707, a Royal Navy fleet under Admiral Sir Cloudesley Shovel was returning to England from the Mediterranean. The fleet consisted of 21 ships and several thousand men. As they approached the English Channel, fog rolled in, and visibility dropped to nearly zero. The navigators aboard the various ships disagreed about their position. Some believed they were safely west of the islands of Scilly, off the southwestern tip of England. Others thought they were further east than estimated. Shovel went with the majority opinion. He was wrong. On the night of the 22nd of October 1707, 4 of his ships struck the rocks of the Scilly Isles. 2,000 men drowned. It was one of the worst naval disasters in British history, and it was caused entirely by a navigation error. The fleet's sailing masters had gotten the longitude wrong. They thought they were in open water. They were actually sailing straight into rocks. This disaster was one of the primary motivations behind the Longitude Act of 1714, in which the British government offered that £20,000 prize for a practical method of determining longitude at sea. The problem was eventually solved decades later by John Harrison's marine chronometer, a clock accurate enough to keep time at sea for months, which allowed navigators to calculate longitude by comparing local noon to the time at a known reference point, like Greenwich. But during the golden age of piracy, which ran roughly from the 1650s to the 1730s, Harrison's chronometer did not yet exist. Longitude remained unsolvable, and that meant the sailing master's job was not just difficult, it was, in a literal sense, impossible to do perfectly. He was being asked to solve a problem that the greatest scientific minds in Europe had not yet cracked, and he was doing it on a leaking wooden ship full of criminals who would kill him if he failed. The relationship between a pirate captain and his sailing master was unlike any other relationship on the ship. In most pirate crews, the captain was elected by the crew and could be deposed by vote. His authority was based on the crew's confidence in him, and that confidence could evaporate after a few bad decisions. The quartermaster handled discipline and the distribution of loot, serving as a check on the captain's power. But the sailing master occupied a completely different space. He was not elected. He was not really part of the political structure at all. He was a technician, a specialist, and his value was purely functional. This gave the sailing master a strange kind of immunity. A pirate crew might mutiny against a captain who made bad tactical decisions. They might replace a quartermaster who distributed loot unfairly, but they almost never moved against a sailing master because there was usually no one who could replace him. You can elect a new captain from among the crew. You cannot elect a new navigator if nobody else knows how to read a chart. There are recorded cases of pirate crews enduring genuinely terrible sailing masters, men who were drunk half the time or incompetent or cruel, simply because the alternative was having no navigator at all. The crew would complain, grumble, threaten, but in the end they would keep the man alive and at his post because they needed him more than they disliked him. On the other hand, a truly skilled sailing master could negotiate extraordinary terms for himself. Higher shares of plunder, better food, private quarters, exemption from dangerous boarding actions. Some sailing masters essentially set their own terms, and the crew agreed, because what choice did they have? You do not argue with the man who is keeping you from dying of thirst on a becalmed ocean 300 miles from the nearest island. This leverage extended even to interactions with the captain. In several historical accounts, sailing masters directly contradicted their captains on matters of course and heading, and the captains backed down. Not because the captain was weak, but because the captain knew that the sailing master had information he did not. If the sailing master said, "We cannot sail through that passage at night because I believe there is an uncharted shoal," the captain listened. He had to. The cost of being wrong was not embarrassment, it was the loss of the ship. One of the most remarkable sailing masters in pirate history was a man named Israel Hands, who served under the infamous Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard. Hands was the master of Blackbeard's flagship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, and later took command of one of Blackbeard's sloops, the Adventure. What makes Hands interesting is that he was both a navigator and a fighter, a combination that was relatively rare. Most sailing masters stayed out of combat, both because their skills were too valuable to risk and because many of them had been forced into service and had no desire to fight. Hands, however, was a willing pirate and a violent man. According to historical accounts, Blackbeard himself once shot Hands in the knee during a drunken episode below deck, crippling him. When asked why he did it, Blackbeard reportedly said something to the effect that if he did not shoot one of his own men now and then, they would forget who he was. Despite being crippled, Hands continued to serve as a navigator, which tells you something about how essential his skills were. Blackbeard could afford to shoot his sailing master in the knee because he was confident the man would still navigate for him. A less valuable crew member who got shot would have been thrown overboard. Hands eventually survived the end of Blackbeard's career. When Blackbeard was killed in battle at Ocracoke Inlet in November 1718, Hands was not aboard. He later turned himself in and received a pardon, one of the few members of Blackbeard's crew to escape hanging. Another dimension of the sailing master's importance was his role as the keeper of institutional knowledge. Charts and instruments were critical, but the real treasure was what lived inside the sailing master's head. Years of accumulated experience that could not be written down or transferred. He knew which currents ran strong at which times of year. He knew that the approach to a particular harbor had a sandbar that shifted seasonally. He knew that the winds in a certain stretch of ocean were unreliable in November, but steady in March. He knew the signs that meant a hurricane was coming 2 days before it arrived. This knowledge was the product of thousands of hours of observation, trial, and error. It could not be taught in a classroom. It could not be extracted and given to someone else. It lived with the sailing master, and it died with him. When a sailing master was killed or incapacitated, the loss went beyond the immediate crisis of who will navigate tomorrow. The loss included every piece of hard-won local knowledge that man carried. The crew might find another navigator eventually, but that new navigator would not know the specific waters, the specific hazards, the specific tricks that the previous master had spent years learning. The ship's capability was permanently reduced. This is why pirate ships that lost their sailing masters often abandoned entire operational areas. A crew that had been raiding the coast of Madagascar might retreat all the way back to the Caribbean if their navigator for the Indian Ocean was killed, because no one else on board knew those waters. They were not just losing a man, they were losing access to an entire theater of operations. The sailing master also played a crucial role in one of the most important tactical decisions a pirate ship faced: choosing when and where to attack. A successful pirate attack depended on geography. You needed to intercept merchant ships at predictable points, typically near the mouths of harbors, along known trade routes, or at choke points where geography funneled shipping traffic into narrow passages. The sailing master's knowledge of these routes and choke points determined where the ship positioned itself to hunt. But positioning was only half the equation. The sailing master also had to ensure an escape route. Pirate ships that attacked near a heavily defended port needed to know which direction to flee and how to navigate through whatever obstacles lay in their path. Shallow reefs that a pirate sloop could cross, but a pursuing warship could not. Narrow channels that gave the advantage to a smaller, more maneuverable vessel. Currents that could be exploited to gain speed while a pursuer fought against them. The most successful pirate operations in history were not just exercises in violence. They were exercises in navigation. The pirates who thrived were the ones whose sailing masters understood the geography of their hunting ground so thoroughly that they could appear, strike, and vanish before any response could be organized. Henry Every, who pulled off what may have been the most profitable pirate raid in history when he captured the Mughal treasure ship Ganj-i-Sawai in 1695, succeeded in large part because of superior navigation. Every's ships intercepted the Mughal convoy at exactly the right point in the Indian Ocean, near the mouth of the Red Sea, where the sailing master knew the convoy would pass. After the attack, Every's ships escaped into the vastness of the Indian Ocean and made their way to the Bahamas, a navigation feat that required crossing thousands of miles of open water without getting caught by the pursuing Mughal and East India Company fleets. None of that happens without a brilliant sailing master. There is something deeply human about the sailing master's position that deserves attention. This was a man who carried an enormous burden. The lives of every person on that ship depended on the accuracy of his calculations that he knew were inherently imperfect. Every latitude fix had a margin of error. Every dead reckoning estimate was a best guess. Every chart might contain mistakes. The sailing master went to sleep every night knowing that his work could be wrong, and if it was wrong enough, people would die. And unlike the captain, who shared decision-making with the crew, or the quartermaster, who had clear rules governing his authority, the sailing master worked largely alone. His calculations were his own. His observations were his own. If he made an error, there was usually no one else on board qualified to catch it. The loneliness of that expertise is striking. In a crew of 150 men, the sailing master was the only one who truly understood the ship's position. He could explain it to the captain in general terms, point to a spot on the chart and say, "We are approximately here." But the captain could not verify that claim. He had to trust the sailing master's word. And the rest of the crew had to trust the captain, who was trusting the sailing master. The entire enterprise, the ship, the crew, the operation, ultimately rested on one man's ability to look at the sky and the sea and figure out where he was. In an age before precision instruments, before reliable longitude, before accurate charts, that was an act of extraordinary skill, extraordinary courage, and extraordinary faith. The sailing master was not the captain. He was not the hero of the story. He did not lead charges or give rousing speeches. He sat alone with his charts and his instruments and did the quiet, invisible work that made everything else possible. Every pirate captain who ever sailed, every famous name you have ever heard, Blackbeard, Calico Jack, Anne Bonny, Black Bart, Henry Every, Every single one of them depended on a man whose name you have probably never learned, the man who knew where the ship was, the man without whom the ship was nothing but a floating coffin, drifting nowhere, carrying a crew of the most dangerous people on the ocean, all of whom were completely, utterly lost. And that might be the most pirate thing of all. Not the flags, not the cannons, not the treasure, but the fact that the most feared ships on the ocean were completely helpless without one quiet man and his charts. The whole golden age of piracy, every raid, every escape, every legendary voyage, all of it balanced on the shoulders of the sailing master, the only man on board who knew where the ship was.